My wife said she needed freedom to rediscover herself and expected my support without conditions. I agreed calmly, reallocated my investment portfolio, updated the estate plan, and legally closed our joint accounts. Months later, she reached out when freedom came with financial uncertainty and no shared security. "I just need you to support me without conditions." She said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing for weeks. Calm, measured, and looking just past my eyes instead of into them. I remember the exact weight of that moment. The coffee was still hot in my mug. The kitchen light was doing that thing it always does on Sunday mornings, casting that warm gold across the counter that used to make me feel like our life was something worth keeping. I set the mug down very carefully, and I said, "Okay." Not the way she expected me to say it. Not the tearful, scrambling kind of okay that comes with negotiation and begging and promises. Just okay. One word. Flat. Honest. And I watched her face shift just slightly, like she hadn't quite loaded the response she prepared for that specific version of me. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. We'd been married for 9 years at that point. I was 41, she was 38. We lived in a nice house in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of house that takes 2 incomes to maintain comfortably and 1 person to quietly resent. I'm going to be honest with you the way I couldn't be honest with anyone in my life for a long time. I had seen this coming. Not the speech exactly, not those specific words about freedom and rediscovering herself, but the direction of us. I'd been watching it like someone watches a river starting to bend. You don't always know where it's going, but you know it's no longer going straight. The conversation that Sunday started with something smaller. She'd mentioned a few weeks earlier that she wanted to take a solo trip to Portugal. Just her. 2, maybe 3 weeks. I told her that sounded like a good idea. I meant it. I've never been the kind of person who chains someone to a house. She came back from that trip different. Not different like she'd grown, or come back softer, or come back rested. Different like she'd been handed a new script and was still learning the lines. She started talking about a woman she met there. Divorced, early 40s, running a ceramic studio out of a converted barn near the coast. Happy apparently. Very free apparently. My wife talked about her the way people talk about someone they wish they were. Which is fine. That's fine. People are allowed to want things. But then the conversations at home started changing in texture. She'd get quiet at dinner in a way that used to mean she was tired and started meaning something else. She began spending more time on her phone late at night. Not secretively, just openly, like she didn't think she owed me the performance of hiding it anymore. She started taking long drives alone on weekday evenings. And every time I asked if she was okay, she'd say yes and then pause and then say something like, "I just feel like I've been living someone else's life for a really long time." I always let that sentence land. I never challenged it. Because here is the thing I understood deeply that she maybe didn't credit me for understanding. She had every right to feel that. But feelings are not facts, and wanting change doesn't mean the current life is the problem. Sometimes it just means you haven't figured out who you are inside the life you already have. But I didn't say that to her. Because by then I had stopped being the person she wanted to process things with. I had become the obstacle to be overcome on the way to her real life. So when that Sunday morning came, and she sat down across from me with that particular quiet seriousness, I already knew. I'd known for probably 4 months. I'd been preparing, not in a dramatic, revenge fantasy kind of way. In a practical, realistic, the world doesn't stop when love does kind of way. She told me she felt like she'd built her entire adult identity around being a wife. She told me she felt invisible. She told me she wasn't blaming me, not exactly. She said she just needed space to figure out who she was separate from us. And then she said the sentence that I think she thought was the masterstroke. "I need you to support me through this without conditions." She wanted to explore this new version of herself while keeping everything else intact. The house, the financial stability, the joint accounts, the safety net, the option to return. She wanted freedom from commitment while maintaining all the benefits of commitment. She just didn't say it in those words. I took a slow breath. I looked at her, actually looked at her, in a way I don't think I had in a while. And I said, "I hear you." She exhaled like she'd been holding that breath since Portugal. "Thank you," she said. "I knew you'd understand." "I do understand," I said. "So you're okay with this?" she asked. "I'm going to give you exactly what you're asking for," I said. She smiled. I didn't. Here is where I have to back up just a little. Because you need to understand something about me. I am not a passive person. I've just learned, through years of working in financial consulting and watching people make catastrophically emotional decisions with money, that the most powerful thing a person can do in an uncertain situation is remain completely calm and take the next correct step. One step at a time. No speeches, no performances, just action. The week before that Sunday conversation, I'd already had a meeting with my financial advisor. His name is Victor, and he is perhaps the most unemotional man I've ever met in my life, which is exactly what you want when your personal life is starting to fall apart. I didn't tell him everything. I just told him I needed to look at restructuring some things and asked him to walk me through the most efficient way to separate certain assets cleanly and legally. He asked me if something was happening. I told him I was being careful. He nodded and said, "Smart." Victor has been divorced twice. He didn't need more context. So by that Sunday morning, I had a plan. Not a perfect plan, but a clear one. And it rested entirely on a single principle that I've believed in my whole professional life. You cannot extend infinite credit to an entity that has decided it no longer wants to be accountable to you. She had essentially told me she was withdrawing from the partnership. Not in those words, but functionally. She wanted to be free of the obligations of our marriage while still accessing the infrastructure of it. And I was going to let her experience exactly what that meant in practice. The first thing I did that week was call our estate attorney. His name is Gerald, and he's been doing estate planning for over 30 years. I had him draft updated documents. Not divorce documents. Just updated beneficiary designations and trust language that reflected a more individually structured reality. My individual retirement accounts, the investment accounts in my name alone, a small piece of property I'd inherited from my grandfather, all of it quietly restructured so that my wife's claim to it in any future legal action was significantly more limited than it had been. Gerald asked if I was getting divorced. I said I didn't know yet. He said, "Do you want to be protected either way?" I said yes. He said he'd have everything ready within 10 days. The second thing I did was open a new individual checking account at a different bank entirely. Not the one where our joint accounts lived. A clean account. No connection. And I began, quietly, over the course of a few weeks, shifting my direct deposit there. Not all at once. Gradually. The way you'd turn down a dial rather than flip a switch. The third thing I did was have a conversation with Tom. Tom is my oldest friend. He's known me since we were in our 20s. He watched me meet my wife. He stood up at our wedding. And he is categorically incapable of sugarcoating anything. I called him the evening after that Sunday conversation. I told him what she'd said. There was a pause on the line. Then Tom said, "So she wants to leave, but she wants you to keep the lights on while she does it." I said, "That's a pretty blunt way to put it." He said, "Is it wrong?" I said nothing. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Support her completely." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Oh," and I could hear in that single syllable that he understood exactly what I meant. Meanwhile, my wife began her freedom. She started going out more. She signed up for a painting class on Tuesday nights, which I genuinely thought was a good thing for her. She started seeing a therapist, which I also genuinely thought was a good thing for her. She went to dinner with friends more often. She started talking about wanting to take another trip, maybe this time to Croatia, and I never once complained. Never once made her feel guilty. Never once positioned myself as the thing standing between her and her best life. Because I wasn't anymore. She had made that decision. I was just updating the paperwork to reflect the reality she'd chosen. About 3 weeks after that Sunday, I told her I was going to close our joint savings account. I said it at dinner. Casually. The same way you'd say you were thinking about repainting the hallway. She put down her fork. "What?" she said. "Our joint savings," I said. "I think it makes sense to separate that into individual accounts given the direction we're heading." "What direction?" she said. I looked at her steadily. "You told me you needed freedom and independence," I said. "I'm helping you get there." "I didn't mean financially," she said. "What did you mean?" I asked. She struggled with the answer. Not because she was being evasive, but because she had genuinely never run the equation all the way to its end. She had imagined freedom. She had not imagined freedom with a budget. "I still need access to our savings," she said. "We have a mortgage. We have shared expenses." "I know," I said. "I'll continue covering the mortgage through my individual account. I'm not trying to destabilize the household." "Then why are you doing this?" she said. "Because," I said, very carefully, "you told me you need to rediscover who you are separate from us. And part of discovering who you are is understanding what your own financial picture looks like. You have a good salary. You have your own income. I think it's important that you understand what your life actually costs when it's yours. She stared at me for a long moment. This feels punitive, she said. Does it? I said. Or does it just feel like independence? She didn't have an answer for that. I want to be transparent about something here. I was not doing this out of pure altruistic teaching. I was protecting myself. I had watched too many people, too many clients, too many friends sit across from lawyers 2 years later and discover that their spouse had been slowly spending down joint accounts on the way out the door. I was not going to be that person. And beyond the financial protection, there was something else. Something more personal. I needed her to understand that support is not the same as unconditional funding. I needed her to feel, in a very concrete way, what it meant to operate without a partner. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I was tired of being treated like infrastructure. The painting class became something she clearly looked forward to. She'd come home on Tuesdays with that particular kind of lightness that people get when they've found something that belongs only to them. I was glad for that. I'm not a monster. I loved her for a long time. And there was a piece of me, maybe smaller than it should have been at that point, that still hoped she would wake up and decide that what she actually wanted was a deeper version of the life she already had. But hope is not a strategy. And I was done building plans around her potential change of heart. One evening in late October, about 6 weeks after that conversation, she sat down across from me again. Same kitchen, different light, that autumn blue-gray that the Pacific Northwest does in the evenings. She said, I think I want to try living alone for a while. I said, okay. I want to get an apartment, she said. Okay, I said. I need some help with the deposit, she said. And the first few months while I get settled. I looked at her. You want me to fund your separation from me? I said. She flinched slightly. I want support, she said. You said you'd support me. I will, I said. But support doesn't mean I write the check for the life you want to live without me. That's not what I'm asking. That's exactly what you're asking, I said. Not unkindly, just accurately. You want me to finance your independence. And I'm going to gently suggest that if you need someone else to pay for your freedom, then it's worth questioning whether you're actually ready for it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, You've changed. I said, I've adapted. She got the apartment anyway. She found a studio downtown, decent location, her own money from her own account, which was a good thing actually, because it meant she could do it. She had more capacity than she'd given herself credit for. And some part of me was proud of her for that. In a strange, complicated way you feel proud of someone when you're also in the middle of quietly grieving the end of your marriage. She moved her personal things out over a weekend in November. I helped carry boxes, not because I was performing graciousness, because there was no universe in which I was going to stand in the doorway with my arms crossed while she carried boxes by herself. That's just not who I am. The house felt different after that. Quieter, obviously, but also something else. It felt honest. Like the thing that had been pretending to be a home had finally dropped the performance and was just being a building again. And there was a strange peace in that. I cooked dinner for myself. I watched what I wanted to watch. I worked late when I needed to and didn't explain it to anyone. I went for long runs in the mornings in a way I'd let slip over the last few years. I started sleeping better, which I think surprised me more than anything. The legal separation process was quiet. We hadn't filed for divorce yet. She hadn't asked for it. I hadn't pushed for it. There was this strange liminal period where we were neither together nor officially apart. Just two people who'd been married for 9 years living in different zip codes and occasionally sending each other a text about a shared bill or an insurance question. During that period, I finalized the estate plan changes with Gerald. I restructured my investment portfolio completely, shifting heavier into positions that were entirely in my name, individual brokerage accounts, solo retirement structures, assets that would be significantly harder to divide in any future proceeding. Victor walked me through each change methodically. Every time he'd pull up a new account to discuss, he'd ask, Is this one we're keeping joint? And every time I'd say no, he'd make a small note and move to the next line item. By the end of those sessions, the financial overlap between my wife and me was reduced to essentially the mortgage on a house she no longer lived in. Tom called me around that time to check in. He asked how I was doing. I told him, honestly, that I was doing better than I expected. He asked if I was sure. I said yes. He said, You know most people in your position would be furious. I said I was. I just did it quietly. He laughed. Then he said, She's going to come back. I said, Maybe. He said, What will you do if she does? I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, I'll decide then. He didn't push it. That's the thing about old friends. They know when you need them to just let something sit. December came. The first holidays apart. She texted me a couple days before Christmas, asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. I said sure. We met at a small place near her apartment. She looked good, rested in some ways, strained in others. She'd gotten her hair cut shorter, which looked nice. She was wearing a coat I'd never seen, which struck me in that particular way that small, unfamiliar things do when they signify the scale of change. We made small talk for a few minutes. Then she said, "This is harder than I thought it would be." I waited. "Being alone," she said. "I thought I'd feel more free. I thought it would feel like I was finally in the right life." I didn't say anything yet. "It mostly just feels lonely," she said. I said, "That's normal. It takes time to build a life." She looked up at me. "Is that what you're doing? Building a new life?" I said, "Yeah." She seemed unsettled by the simplicity of that answer. Are you seeing anyone?" she asked. "No," I said. "Not yet." The yet registered on her face. We finished the coffee. Hugged outside. One of those hugs that's almost a muscle memory, the kind of hug your body knows how to do even when everything else has changed. She smelled the same. That got me for a second. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. But I drove home alone, and I made dinner, and I watched something on television that I chose entirely by myself, and I went to bed, and I didn't cry, which was progress. January was cold. She texted a few times. Casual things. A question about the car insurance renewal. A photo of something funny she saw on the street that she knew I would appreciate. The kind of texts that were technically about nothing and were actually about something. I answered them warmly but briefly. I was not going to close a door on her, but I was also not going to hold it open indefinitely while she made up her mind. Somewhere in February, something shifted with her. The texts became more frequent, more personal. She mentioned once that the heating in her apartment wasn't working right, and she was freezing every night. She mentioned once that she'd had a difficult meeting at work and there was no one to decompress with when she got home. She mentioned once, late on a Thursday night, that she'd been sitting on her couch and realized she hadn't spoken to another person in 4 days. I read that last one a few times, and I felt something for her. I genuinely did. But I also felt something that I think was important to feel. I felt the clarity of consequence. She had built this. Not me. Not the marriage. Not the house. Or the life we'd constructed. Or the person I'd been for 9 years. She had walked out of something functional and alive into something that turned out to be more idea than reality. And now she was learning the difference, and I was not responsible for rescuing her from the lesson. The call came on a Tuesday night in March. I was in the kitchen making pasta. Her name on the phone screen still gave me something that wasn't quite a jolt, but was adjacent to one. I picked up. "Hey," I said. "Hey," she said. She sounded different. Not broken, but a little unmoored. Like someone who'd been out at sea long enough to start really missing land. "I wanted to talk to you," she said. "Is that okay?" "Of course," I said. She took a breath. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," she said. "About what I wanted. About why I left. About what I thought freedom was going to feel like." I turned the stove down a little and leaned against the counter. "How does it feel?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Expensive," she said. "Not metaphorically. Actually literally expensive." She told me that her rent, while manageable, had turned out to be a heavier lift than she'd anticipated once all the utilities and the groceries and the everything of living alone added up in real time. She told me that she'd had a car repair in February that had come out of savings she hadn't budgeted for. She told me that her company had gone through a restructuring and her position wasn't cut, but her raise had been frozen, which put her monthly projections slightly off from what she'd planned. She told me all of this in the measured tone of someone trying not to sound like they're asking for something while very clearly needing something. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "I don't need money." I said, "Okay." She said, "I just miss having a partner." I said, "I understand that." She said, "I miss you." And there it was. I'm going to be honest. There was a version of me that wanted to say I miss you too and collapse the distance entirely right there on the phone. Because I did miss her. I missed the good version of her, the version that existed before Portugal and before the painting class and before the word freedom started meaning something different than it used to. I missed sitting in the same room without needing to say anything. I missed knowing someone was there. I missed being a we. But I also knew something I hadn't known back on that Sunday morning in September. I knew what she'd been willing to put at risk for the feeling of possibility. And I knew that feelings of possibility are real and valid and also temporary. And I knew that what she missed most right now was probably not me specifically. What she missed was security. What she missed was the feeling of knowing that if something went wrong, someone was already there to absorb part of the impact. And that's not nothing. That's actually not nothing at all. But it is also not the same as choosing someone. I need to ask you something, I said. Okay, she said. When you said you needed freedom, I said, what did you think that would look like? What were you imagining when you pictured your life after it? She thought about it. She actually took it seriously, which I appreciated. I imagined feeling light, she said. I imagined waking up and feeling like the day was mine. I imagined not feeling like I was performing a version of my life for someone else. And did you feel any of that? I asked. Some of it, she said. For a while, the first few weeks in the apartment, I honestly felt amazing. I'd come home and the space was just mine, and I could do whatever I wanted, and there was something really beautiful about that. But, I said, but beautiful isn't the same as good, she said. And freedom without anyone to share it with gets heavy after a while. I nodded to myself in an empty kitchen. What about finding yourself? I asked. Did that happen? She laughed. It was a short, slightly sad laugh. I found out I'm a lot more dependent on connection than I thought I was, she said. Which isn't exactly the romantic discovery I was expecting. I told her I needed time to think. She said she understood. She didn't push. She said goodnight. I finished making pasta and ate it alone and thought about the strange circular mathematics of what had happened. She had left to find herself. And she found out that herself needed people. Specifically, she found out that herself needed the kind of stable, present, consistent person that she'd spent the last several months treating as a limitation instead of an asset. The question was what I was supposed to do with that. I called Tom the next day. I told him about the phone call. He listened without interrupting, which is unusual for him. When I finished, he said, "So what are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Do you want her back?" I said, "I want the version of her that was choosing me. I'm not sure if that version still exists." He said, "That's a real answer." I said, "I know." He said, "What changed in you while she was gone?" And that question sat with me for a long time. Here's what changed. When she left, I grieved. Not publicly, not dramatically, but I grieved. There's a kind of grief that's just quiet and persistent, like a low hum that you stop noticing after a while, but that shapes everything you do. I grieved the future we'd talked about, the places we were going to travel to when we had more time, the house we discussed buying together on the coast someday, the quiet idea of growing older with someone who already knew everything about you. I grieved all of that. And then, somewhere around November, I stopped grieving it. Not because I stopped caring, but because I started building something that was just mine. I got back into running, proper long-distance running, the kind I'd let go of in my early 30s. I started having dinner with friends more regularly. I took a solo weekend trip to a cabin in the mountains and read 3 books and slept 10 hours a night and came back feeling like a different person. I got better at my work, somehow, maybe because I wasn't carrying the ambient anxiety of a marriage that was quietly unraveling. I became, in the absence of her, more fully myself. And that was the complicated thing. Because the discovery she had been hoping to make out there in her studio apartment, I had made it right here, in the life she'd left. I called her back 4 days after her call. I asked if she wanted to have dinner. Not coffee. Dinner. She said yes immediately. We went to a place we'd been to dozens of times over the years, a neighborhood Italian restaurant that had been there since before we met, the kind of place where the owner knows you by face if not by name. She looked nervous, which I understood. I probably looked composed in a way that felt slightly unreadable. We ordered. We talked about normal things for the first part of the meal. Work. The neighborhood. A show we'd both been watching separately. And then she said, "I want to talk about us." I said, "Okay." She said, "I made a mistake." I said, "Tell me more about that." "I thought what I wanted was to get away from our life," she said. "But I think what I actually wanted was to feel seen inside our life." And instead of saying that, I turned it into something about freedom and independence, which wasn't wrong exactly, but also wasn't the whole truth. I looked at her. What was the whole truth? I asked. She pressed her lips together. "I was lonely inside our marriage," she said. "Not because you were absent, but because I felt like we'd stopped looking at each other. Like we were 2 people running parallel tracks and occasionally reporting in. And I didn't know how to ask for more connection, so instead I labeled the whole thing a cage and tried to blow the door off." I was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you just say that?" I asked. "Because," she said, "I didn't know it until I left and sat in a very quiet apartment for 5 months and had to actually meet myself." I appreciated the honesty. I want to be clear about that. I genuinely did. Because that was more self-aware than anything she'd said to me in the 2 years before she left. But appreciation is not the same as reconciliation. And clarity, while beautiful, doesn't automatically rebuild what dissolved. I hear you, I said. I really do. She looked up. But, she said. But I need you to understand something, I said. Okay. When you left, I said, I made some changes. To our accounts. To the estate planning. To how our finances are structured. Not as punishment, but because when someone tells you they're opting out of the partnership, you update the paperwork to match reality. She nodded slowly. I know, she said. I noticed. And I need you to know that those changes aren't going away just because this conversation is happening. She looked at me carefully. What does that mean for us? She said. It means, I said, that if there is an us going forward, it's a different us. I'm not going to rebuild a joint life on the assumption that we're the same two people who had that Sunday morning conversation in September. We're not. I'm not. Neither am I, she said. Good, I said. Then we can talk about what something new might actually look like. There was no dramatic proposal to restart. No tearful scene in the restaurant. Just two people who used to be married having an honest conversation over pasta and red wine. She asked me if I was open to trying. I told her I was open to dating her, which is not the same thing, and she understood that. She said, that's fair. I said, it's not about fairness. It's about starting from where we actually are instead of pretending we're somewhere else. She nodded. I can do that, she said. I believe you, I said. But I need you to understand that I'm not going to go back to being invisible infrastructure. I'm not going to be the financial floor beneath your freedom experiments. If we do this again, it's because you are actively choosing me. Present tense. Every day. I want that, she said. Then we start there. I said. That was the beginning of something that I'm honestly not sure I know how to name. Not reconciliation exactly. More like negotiation. More like two people who'd both changed deciding whether the new versions of themselves were actually compatible. We started seeing each other intentionally. Dinners. Walks. The kind of dates we hadn't been on since we were first together. She stayed in her apartment. I stayed in the house. Which felt strange and also correct. We weren't going backwards. We were, if anything, starting from scratch. There were hard conversations. About what the marriage had actually been like in those last 2 years before Portugal. About the ways I had become withdrawn, not because I didn't care, but because I'd stopped believing my presence was something she was still seeking. About the way she had stopped reaching toward me and started treating my predictability as a stand-in for warmth. We both had real things to own. And for the first time in years, we both actually owned them. No deflecting. No shifting blame. Just two grown adults sitting across from each other and saying, here is where I fell short. Here is what I should have done differently. Here is the person I am trying to become. I want to be honest about the financial piece one more time because I think it matters. She never asked me to restore the joint accounts. She never asked me to undo the estate changes. She asked once, carefully, in early April, if we were ever going to get back to a place where things were shared again. I said maybe. I said if we rebuilt this and it held, and if we decided to commit to something permanent again, then we could talk about what a financial partnership looked like between two people who understood each other better. She said, that's reasonable. I said, I know it doesn't feel romantic. She said, it feels honest, which is better. And something in that exchange shifted something in me. Not everything. Not immediately. But something. Because the version of her that came back was more honest than the version that left. And maybe that was the whole point. Maybe the freedom she needed wasn't freedom from me. Maybe it was freedom from the version of herself that had forgotten how to say true things. I'm telling this story because I've thought about it for a long time and I think there's something in it worth understanding. Not about marriage exactly. Not about divorce. About what happens when someone mistakes comfort for constraint. About what happens when the security of a life gets rebranded as a cage. About what happens when you stop growing inside a good thing and assume the good thing is the problem. She thought she needed to leave. Maybe she did. Maybe the leaving was the only way she was ever going to find the thing she was missing. I'm not sure. I'm not wise enough to know if we could have gotten there without all of this. But I do know this. The version of us that exists now is more real than anything we had in years 7 or 8. We know each other's actual edges now. We've seen what the other person looks like when they're not performing for the relationship. She saw me be calm and strategic when I was hurting. I saw her be honest when she was humbled. Those are not small things. We're not where we were. We're somewhere better, I think, or at least somewhere more honest. She's still in her apartment. I'm still in the house. The estate plan is still the way Victor and Gerald set it up. The individual accounts are still separate. We have dinner 3 or 4 times a week. We talk more than we ever did when we were married. We say things we never said when we assumed we had the rest of our lives to say them. She asked me last week whether I thought we would ever get married again. Each other, she meant. To each other. I laughed a little. I said, ask me in a year. She said, that's terrifying and also kind of perfect. I said, yeah. She said, you're different. I said, I told you I adapted. She said, I actually like this version of you better. I said, I like this version of you better too. And we sat with that for a minute without trying to turn it into anything more than what it was. I don't know how this ends. I genuinely don't. And I've made peace with not knowing. I used to be someone who needed the plan. The 5-year plan, the 10-year plan, the retirement plan, the life plan. Everything mapped and accounted for and projected to the second decimal place. And what I learned, somewhere between that Sunday morning in September and this moment, is that some things can't be planned. They can only be lived. Carefully. Honestly. One accurate step at a time. She made a choice. I honored it fully. And then I made choices of my own. And now we're both somewhere we didn't expect to be. Whether that somewhere becomes something permanent or whether it eventually resolves into something else entirely, I'm okay with the uncertainty. Because I know something now that I didn't know when this started. I know who I am when no one is watching. I know what I'm worth when the infrastructure disappears. I know how to be alone without being destroyed by it. And I know, if something is worth building, it gets built on real ground. Not on someone's desperate return from a lesson they should have learned with me instead of without me. But maybe on 2 people who've both done the hard work and decided to start again, not from where they were, but from where they actually are.